Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Stephanie Singer, and I'm the Director of Arts and Ideas. And on behalf of the JCCSF, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program, Amos Oz, writer, activist, icon, with Robert Alter. Thank you so much for coming. So before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to say hello and thanks to our wonderful bookstore partner, Books Inc. Ingrid's in the back. Bob will be signing books right after the program, so it's a perfect opportunity for you to get a signed copy of Amos Oz while supporting one of our fine independent bookstores at the same time. We know that it is an especially difficult time to show up and be in community these days, and sincerely appreciate your choice to come together for tonight's program. The JCCSF holds itself as a safe space for all to gather, and we really mean it. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to a few upcoming programs that we hope you'll find of interest. On Sunday, March 3rd, Bay Area Jews and allies throughout Northern California will gather for an unprecedented march down Market Street to champion the values of inclusion, respect, belonging, and democracy, standing united against anti-Semitism. We hope to see you there at the Unity March. And then on Wednesday, March 20th, we welcome Noah Feldman and Cheryl Sandberg to the JCCSF for a conversation about Feldman's forthcoming book, To Be a Jew Today, a new guide that invites us to consider a more capacious understanding of Jewish lives and Jewish futures in the diaspora. And then on Friday, April 19th, in partnership with One Table and Honeymoon Israel, we're hosting a young adult vegetarian Shabbat dinner and discussion with cookbook author Micah Siva, author of Nosh, plant-forward recipes celebrating modern Jewish cuisine. And finally, on Tuesday, April 30th, we welcome the OG doyen of Jewish cuisine, Joan Nathan, for a conversation about Joan's new book, My Life in Recipes, with chefs Charles Fan of The Slanted Door and Murad Lalu from Aziza and Murad. You can find out about these programs and many others on our website, jccsf.org. Amos Oz was one of Israel's most prominent and widely read writers, as well as a regular contender for the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was the author of dozens of novels, several volumes of short fiction, 3 books for young readers, and many works of nonfiction written between 1965 and shortly before his death in 2018 at the age of 79. In Amos Oz, writer, activist, icon, the first published biography of Oz, Robert Alter explores Oz's relationship with his family, his prolific writing career, his activism in support of a pluralistic Israel, and his work as an international lecturer, speaking of literature and his lifelong quest for a peaceful resolution to a conflict that he did not live to see deteriorate into its current tragic phase. I'm just wondering, out of curiosity, how many of you saw Amos Oz speak here at some point? Nice. Very nice, yeah. He was beloved and a perennial favorite, and I think I presented him 3 or 4 times myself. So we loved having him here and bringing him to the community. And much like our esteemed guest tonight, Robert Alter is professor of the graduate school, an emeritus professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's taught since 1967. He's the award-winning author of 24 books, including 2 prize-winning volumes on biblical narrative and poetry, award-winning translations of Genesis and the 5 books of Moses, and his seminal 3-volume translation of the Hebrew Bible. His books have been translated into 10 different languages. He's the recipient of the Robert Kirsch Award from the Los Angeles Times for lifetime contribution to American letters, and the Charles Homer Haskins Prize for Career Achievement from the American Council of Learned Societies. And he called Amos Oz a friend for more than 50 years. We're honored and delighted to welcome Robert Alter back to the JCCSF.
Thank you, Stephanie, for your generous remarks. It's a pleasure to be back at this JCC, which is such a beacon for cultural activities. I guess I should begin by saying a few words about the challenge of writing a biography of someone who was your friend. A word about how we became friends. I started writing about modern Hebrew literature many, many years ago, probably before some people in the audience were born in the 1960s. And at the time, there were very few people who were writing in English about Hebrew literature, especially people who could put together a reasonably literate sentence in English. So the pieces that I wrote, which were more than reviews, they tended to be review essays, got a lot of attention and a lot of attention in Israel. And the writers about whom I wrote were gratified by what I had to say about them, not just because it was positive, but because they thought I had got things right. So Amos was one of those. He came to I think my first piece, it was on him and A.B. Hoshua, who also became my friend. And Amos came to the Bay Area to give a couple of talks. Those of you who have heard him, he was a magnetic speaker. And he got in touch with me, and I invited him out to dinner at a Mexican restaurant. I think it was the first time he ever ate Mexican food, because he was very cautious about what to order and went along with what I ordered. It was a success, a culinary success, but it was also a human success, and we remained good friends over the years. In the early '90s, two of my sons were spending the year in Arad, where Amos had moved from his 25 years at Kibbutz Hulda, and he was extremely welcoming to them. I invited them over for dinner and gave them moral support. So there was a strong connection. So how do you write about someone who's your friend? One thing you do is to avoid hagiography. I recognize even in our friendship that Amos had his faults, and I went into a few of those in the book. For example, maybe this is not just an example, it was a central thing. He was a performer. He was a wonderful performer. He had a gift for it, but I think it also was imprinted on him in his childhood. That is, he was the precious only son, and a gifted son, and good looking from early childhood on. So when guests came over to their tiny apartment, Amos would be trotted out by his parents and asked to perform. And that's what he did his whole life. That's one of the reasons why he was so good. But the performance was also a kind of imprisonment in the role of performer. This struck me once, and this is a detail I mention in the book. We were both at a conference in Jerusalem. This probably was about 25 years ago. I no longer remember what the conference was at. It was in a very large lecture hall on the campus of the Hebrew University. And in the break between sessions, the hall, of course, emptied out, and Amos and I stood in the back talking. And what we were talking about? Well, what you always talk about in Israel, what's called in Hebrew, hamatzav, the situation. And this was something of compelling interest to both of us. And he had certain things he really wanted to tell me. But as he spoke, I started getting this weird sensation that he was talking not to me, but to an audience of several hundred people, because he couldn't quite escape that role. So in a way, there was something a little bit tragic about his life. But he was a loyal friend to many people, and a devoted husband and father, despite the posthumous scandal raised by his younger daughter, about which I could talk in the Q&A if anybody wants my take on this. So, what did I learn about Amos Oz from writing the biography? To begin with, it became clear to me that there were two of him. There was Amos Oz, the charming public literary personality, someone who enchanted audiences and enchanted readers in his books, and was a man of conscience who steadfastly stuck by his guns, even when his position on reconciliation with the Palestinians became an embattled position. And I have to, one thing occurred to me in these last terrible months. Leading up to October 7th, which would of course would have horrified him, there was an increasing chorus of voices going back, I don't know, at least 6 or 7 years, which voices that said the two-state solution is dead in the water. And in fact, even Amos's good friend, A.B. Yoshua, whom we all called Bully, came out with this position, that he started writing articles which he held fast to until his death a couple of years after Amos's. Articles saying, well, the two-state solution is finished. We'll never be able to get there. So what we have to do is find a way to live in a single state, Palestinians and Israelis side by side with good relations. Now, Amos thought this was profoundly misguided. His position was something like this. There's been 100 years of bloodshed between these two peoples. It didn't start in 1947. It started in 1921. And there is suspicion, fear, hatred of each side by the other side. And there's no conceivable way these two peoples are going to live together in a single state. And then he had one of his little routines. He said, if you look around, the successful countries where you have different ethnic, linguistic, religious communities living side by side amicably in a single nation are Switzerland and Switzerland and Switzerland. And then he would point out Cyprus and Northern Ireland and a whole list of other places where it simply didn't work. Now, what happened after October 7th, I'm not going to talk about October 7th, was that with the expression of the vilest kind of hatred and brutality on the part of Hamas against the Israelis, which then, of course, provoked anger and a desire for revenge on the part of the Israelis, everybody started saying, news commentators, heads of state, the one state is not going to be a solution. We have to find a way to get to two states. And that's what Amos Oz said till his dying day. So it's a painful kind of confirmation of the rightness of his position. So let me go back to the two Amos Oz's. As I said, the first one was the accomplished public person who was poised and engaging in social situations, who was an absolute charmer on the lecturing stage, and who was an extremely successful writer. Now, I don't think that every single one of his books is equally successful, but he certainly wrote half a dozen books, maybe even more than that, that will live, that people will want to read as we get to the end of the present century, and maybe in the next century as well. And that's a great achievement. Very few writers get there. So there was that. And then there was the Amos Oz who was troubled by demons, the dark Amos Oz. And you can see some of this in the darker aspects of his fiction. It's all not sunlight and melody. People are driven by impulses they can't control. They do terrible things to each other, and so on and so forth. Now, his mother is a key to this darker, the subterranean self in two ways. She was a very imaginative woman. She read widely in 6 languages, and she shared stories with Amos. And these stories were often very spooky stories. They were stories about, harking back to her European background. She grew up in Rovno, which I think now is part of Poland. Ghana, or maybe it's not. The borders keep shifting in that part of Europe. So these stories are stories about gnomes and witches and ghosts lurking in dark forests. Not entirely what you want to tell to a little kid, but he swallowed them up and they became part of his imaginative world. And she didn't hesitate to share with him actual stories about the people in her hometown. And they were not happy stories. They were stories about suicides and blighted love and so forth. All that she passed on to her little boy until the age of 8 or so, at which point her mental problems became so severe that she was barely talking. She was sitting catatonic in a chair, staring out the window. Okay, so that's one way in which the dark aspect of Amos Oz's imaginative world gets into him from her. The other, of course, is her suicide. Now, Israel being a kind of extended shtetl, everybody from the beginning of his career knew that his mother had committed suicide when he was 12 years old. They the suicide was transparent to Israeli readers in a number of the pieces of fiction he wrote. For example, there's a fine novella called On the Hill of Evil Counsel. There is actually a place in Jerusalem called the Hill of Evil Counsel. And in that story, the father is dutiful and decent, but very square. And the mother is highly imaginative and emotional. So that was like Amos's parents. And at the end of the story, the mother bolts from the family and runs away with a British admiral, I think. And they get in a car and start driving east. That's all you hear about. Now, everybody in Israel at that time, I think that was the early 1970s, knew this was a thinly disguised version of his mother's suicide. So that was known. He kept absolutely mum about it year after year. Although he had a close marriage, he never actually told his wife about it until, well, he did eventually. But it took something like 17, 18, 19 years before he told this story of his wife's suicide. Then, when he was in his early 60s, he decided he would write about it. He wrote about it in a fragmentary way, in an experimental novel written in verse called The Same Sea, S-E-A. But it kind of flickers in and out of the story 2 or 3 times. It's not a main part of the story. Then, famously, in A Tale of Love and Darkness, which is certainly one of his greatest books, he tackled it head on. First, he reports about his mother's extreme psychological damage. And then he, of course, was not present at the suicide. What she did was she went to Tel Aviv to her sister's apartment. And in Tel Aviv, she took an overdose. And she had sleeping medications and died. Now, to be strictly cautious about all this, it's always possible that it wasn't a suicide, that she had severe insomnia. She was taking heavy doses of sleeping medication, and they weren't working. She was up all night, night after night. So it's at least conceivable that she overdosed herself accidentally in desperation to be able to sleep through the night. But I think it's more likely that it was deliberate. And that's the way Amos always construed it. And he, in the book, in A Tale of Love and Darkness, he reports 2 or 3 understandable reactions on his part. One is anger that she abandoned him, and then there is desperation that he lost her. Well, you would think that writing, and what he does, for those who have not read A Tale of Love and Darkness, it ends with a knockout punch, which is he imagines as a novelist, step by step, how she walks through the rain-swept streets at night of Tel Aviv, and then goes back to her sister's apartment and takes the overdose, and then the screaming siren of the ambulance that comes too late. And in his reconstruction, he wants to be there to scream to her, "Don't do it, don't do it." Now, pop psychology would tell you that, okay, he's got it out of his system. He's finally come out with this painful secret, and this is what we call catharsis. And now he can go on with his life. But a couple of revelations, they were revelations for me toward the end of his life, indicated that was not the story. That is, there were two women that he talked to in his last year and a half. One was the editor of his last book, Judas, Shira Haddad, who's clearly a much younger person and an intelligent interlocutor. And the other was, I've never met her, but the other one I actually know personally, and that's Nurit Gertz, who is a critic of Israeli fiction and Israeli cinema. I actually brought her to Berkeley once to teach for a semester. So to these two women, he confided his thoughts about his life as he knew the life was drawing to an end. And what he says is, certainly for me, it was shocking. He says something like this: I am worth nothing. I know that I am worth nothing because the woman who was the most important person in the world to me abandoned me, and she would never have done that if she had loved me. So she didn't love me, and if she didn't love me, I couldn't be worth anything. So for me, that was a shocking thing to hear of course I'm not quoting verbatim, but it's a pretty close paraphrase. It was a shocking thing to hear this from someone who had lived a very successful life, who was a brilliant writer, who was admired by many people. So that was the other demon, the fiercer demon, I would say, that pursued him to his dying day. As much as he had made his way successfully in the world, there was something inside him that said, you are not worth anything. Your mother, whom you loved dearly, abandoned you. And he always framed that as abandonment. You know, there are other ways. It's always painful to talk about a parent's suicide, but there are obviously other ways to speak of it. Nevertheless, he succeeded. And I'll say just a few words about his success as a writer. And then I would like to read the last couple of pages of my book, which tries to sum up certain things. He found ways, to begin with, to transform his own painful experience into high art. And I'll mention maybe a couple of examples. One is let me just give you a sketch of the beginning of his career. First, he published Where the Jackals Howl, which are stories based on his experience of the kibbutz, a dark experience. As much as he loved the kibbutz ideal and was committed to it, he saw terrible things happening on the kibbutz between people. And most of the characters in Where the Jackals Howl are how should I put it, isolates. They're lonely people living with illusions. If they have love affairs, they're fitful and unsatisfying. And it is not what you would expect from somebody who is an idealistic young man who was in his 20s, committed to the aspirations of the kibbutz. And I should add this, because this is a kind of map of his conception of reality. The kibbutz has perimeters, and there are fences that mark those perimeters, and at certain points on the perimeters, perhaps searchlights posted. But out beyond the kibbutz are the jackals. And they're no longer there in Chul, but they were in the 1950s and early 60s when maybe the early 1960s when he wrote these stories. And the jackals howl ferociously through the night, and they're very much anthropomorphized as the enemies of humanity. They have dark, destructive impulses. So who are the jackals? The simplistic explanation is that they're the Arabs. And among other things, I suppose they are, but they're also the chaotic character of nature itself, which the idealism of the kibbutz is naive about and will never be able to tame. And they are the embodiments of the dark side of the psyche of every human being. So it becomes quite powerful that way. So he published Where the Jackals Howl. He published someplace else, which is a novel about the kibbutz, is so-so as a novel. And then he published My Michael, which is the book that made him famous. In fact, I discovered that there's a German publisher that polled its readers as to the 100 most important novels written in the 20th century. And the readers thought that My Michael should be listed as one of those. And you have a replication of his parents' marriage, but radically transformed. That is, Michael is a graduate student, I think in geology at the Hebrew University, plodding along to get his master's thesis done. And a decent fellow, but unimaginative, and he doesn't really understand his wife, Hannah. At one point she says to him, "Michael, I don't think you know me at all." And she is wildly imaginative and very troubled. She has these extreme hallucinations, and she some of them are very sexual and even violently sexual. A number of them center around these Arab twins that she used to play with as a kid, Aziz and Khalil, and she has sort of threesome sexual fantasies about them. Now, that's not his mother, that part of it. That is, her psychosis had, as far as one can make out, nothing to do with sexuality. If you're in a catatonic state, you're not thinking about sex. But he took the hint of his visceral experience of his troubled mother and transformed it into this fictional character, Hannah Gonen, who I think is one of the remarkable female characters in 20th century fiction. So then he was off and running, and he was being invited to international poetry festivals and readings, and the book came out in many translations, and he became, quote, a figure. Now, I'll jump from the first important novel to the last novel period, Judas, the one for which he gave a reading here at the JCC. There, I don't think you see much of the traces of the family that he grew up in. But what you do have is he was very attuned to ideological fanaticism. And the reason for that is double. First, his family. They were all right-wingers. They were members of Cherut, which was the forerunner of Likud. They were adherents to Jabotinsky. They despised Ben-Gurion. They thought that socialist Zionism was the running dog of the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So as he was growing up, he heard a lot of fierce ideological declamations and fierce ideological debate. And I think that he caught this in much of his fiction much better than any other, or much more, I should say, than any other Hebrew writer. So in Judas, you have the father of this mysterious, sexy, erotically elusive woman was a member of the Zionist Directorate before the state. And as the state was about to be declared, he said, we can't go this way. We have to be beyond states now. We have to live in peace with the Palestinians. And of course, he was regarded as a traitor. And he was ostracized. And then there is debate between his daughter and the man whose caregiver, in a way, the protagonist is, who is a loyal adherent of Ben-Gurion. So the superheated ideological atmosphere in which Amos Oz grew up is brilliantly transformed into the fictional situation of the novel Judas. So as much as he was obsessed by his mother's suicide, that was not the only thing that preoccupied him or that made him a writer. Okay, with that, I'm going to go to these last couple of pages in my book, which try to sum up something about Amos Oz. So let me fish out my glasses. As a friend of Amos, I had certain views on the kind of person he was. But the documentation of his life that I looked into in undertaking the biography made me aware that there were dimensions of his character I could not have seen. Perhaps the essential understanding I came to is that his was a life courageously lived. To the very end, he was plagued by dark, devastating thoughts he could never really shake, and this is what I've just explained. What he possessed to confront them was his strong talent, not only as a writer, but as a public advocate for his views on literature and on his nation's vexed political and social dilemmas. Despite the burden of bleakness he carried with him from his childhood till his last days, he never slid into depression, never succumbed to the temptation of escape through intoxicants. Instead, he was actuated by a sense that he had tasks to perform in the world. He relished writing and reveled in developing the rich resources of the Hebrew language that was his medium. And I could go on for great length about his relation to Hebrew and his style. At the same time, as the words he chose for the crucial dedication seen in A Tale of Love and Darkness strongly suggest, he felt that for him to take in the world by writing about it was a demanding moral obligation, one that, quote, brooks neither frivolity nor laughter. And I'm going to interrupt myself to explain about that. There's this wonderful scene in the middle of A Tale of Love and Darkness, which does not have to do with his mother. And I think it's the real heart of the book. He's 6.5 years old, and he's outside in the, heaven help us, concrete-covered courtyard, lying on his back, looking at the sunset. And he's overwhelmed by the colors of the sunset and by everything around him. He hears a girl playing Beethoven's, or practicing, trying to play Beethoven's Für Elisa. He sees clothing hanging on the lines. He sees alley cats sneaking around. And he says to himself, remember it. Remember all of this. Never forget it. Then someday, maybe 40 years from now, a voice that brooks neither frivolity nor laughter, and that's a quote from the end of Agnon's novel Just Yesterday, a voice that brooks neither frivolity nor laughter will tell you, you have to remember it, you have to write it. So it's a kind of moral burden and a dedication of the vocation of writer. He met that obligation, often with impressive success throughout his life. In a very different way, he felt an obligation to use his talents as a responsible citizen to address his nation's besetting political problems and the fraught moral consequences they entailed. I suspect that conscientiously fulfilling this double demand helped him to push back his private demons, keeping them from leading him to any self-subverting effects they might have entailed. Duty to the writer's vocation and duty to addressing the fate of the nation did not exhaust the life he bravely lived. There were also impulses of spontaneity in his gift for friendship, in his moments of humor, and above all, in his capacity for love. At the age of 12 and a half, the person he loved most abandon him. Again and again, he would see his mother's suicide as a brutal abandonment of her young son. For the next 67 years, he repeatedly interpreted this as her way of saying that she had never really loved him. But where did that harsh conclusion leave him in regard to his own life? There are blighted souls who are incapable of love, but Amos was not one of them. He loved Nili, his wife, who was initially linked with him in an adolescent friendship that turned into a coup de foudre for both of them at the age of 20 and lasted a lifetime. He loved all three of his children, despite the torment that came to cloud his relationship with one of them during his last 7 years. And he genuinely loved his closest friends, men and women. Was he a happy man? The available evidence may indicate that he was, though perhaps only intermittently. What is moving about the life of Amos Oz is that it was finally a kind of triumph against heavy odds. The triumph lies not just in the literary achievement of his finest work, but in the identity he managed to sustain as a loving husband, father, and friend, as a dedicated writer exploring the limits of his art, and an Israeli citizen driven by an imperative of conscience. His was not an easy life, but finally it was a fulfilled life, not only artistically, but morally. Thank you.
Thank you. I just finished Judas. I hadn't read it before. And I can't help but think that you're maybe even uniquely qualified to answer the question, what do we miss as readers in English when we read that book?
I think maybe the it's a good question, and I don't find it easy to answer, which is usually a sign of a good question. I think maybe the reverberations of the rhetoric in the political arguments. That is Atalia. So I'm not missing her name, right? Atalia, this mysterious woman, who's the daughter of Sha'altiel Abravanel, the heretic, the one who resists nationalism. She becomes a spokesperson for her father and deploys some of the kinds of political rhetoric that he would have used. And that's very powerful in the Hebrew. The other thing is that I think it's well translated, if I'm not recalling it, by Nicholas Delange, who is a very good translator. But the Hebrew does a spectacular job in evoking Israel in the 1950s. The first time I was in Israel was a student in 1959. So I have memories of that time and place. The cold, rainy winter nights, the fields of the neighborhood. It comes across pretty well in translation, but it's even better in the Hebrew. And I'll add the following. I heard Amos speaks several times in this country, of course in English. And his English was more than adequate. He was quite fluent. Every once in a while, there'd be a little unidiomatic usage, but nothing serious. And he had an Israeli accent. But then, on the occasion of his retirement from Ben Gurion University, they had a big event for him at the university, and several people were invited to speak briefly. I was one of them. And Amos, he got up. He had no notes at all in front of him. It was the first time I heard him speak in Hebrew. And since I've heard him speak in Hebrew on YouTube, which I wasn't wise to at that point, he got up and there was this outpouring of eloquence. He could touch all the stops. He had at his fingertips all the resonant resources of the Hebrew language, and it was quite magical.
Right here in front.
Can you say something about his relationship with his father and
Yeah.
whether that shows up in any of his work?
Well, it's definitely, well, it's obliquely in these father-like figures in his various novels, and of course directly in A Tale of Love and Darkness. He sensed that his father loved him and meant well by him, but there wasn't a strong rapport between the two of them. His father was a very pedantic man, and I think socially insecure. And the way he covered his insecurity was constantly to make bad jokes and bad puns. So it's not easy to relate to a father like that. And then when at one point the father decided they would undertake a Zionist project, and they would plant some vegetables in their backyard. So they worked together all day trying to dig holes into the rock-hard soil, and somehow got seeds in. And then, of course, the plants died, and the whole thing fell in its face. So it's a touching story. And he recognized that his father was, I'm trying to think how we say this, was a manqué type, someone who had missed out on things, who was kind of a loser. So when his father finally published a book, which he had dreamed of doing for years and years, of course, nobody was interested in buying it. And then a good friend of his, unbeknownst to him, went to the bookstore and bought out the half dozen copies that they had. And then his father was very excited. It sold out in so-and-so's bookstore. Now, when his mother died, the two of them, they couldn't talk about her. And they lived side by side, I would say almost like zombies. Then at 15, actually 14 and a half, I think, he left home and went to the kibbutz, which was an ultimate act of rebellion because the kibbutz was anathema to the right-wing Zionists of his father's circle. And his father didn't visit him only very rarely at the kibbutz, even somehow neglected, maybe out of ignorance, to provide the funds for new clothing for him, which, because at first he wasn't a kibbutz member. And the father quickly married another woman and had 2 daughters with him and went off to England. So I would say they were close to estranged. Now, after his father's death, he edited a volume of his father's articles. And the introduction, I think, is an effort to make amends, in which he praises the writing and praises his father as a scholar. So that's the story.
Thanks for your talk. If I can ask 2 questions. The first one, did I misunderstand that he committed suicide? It
No,
was his
no, his
mother.
mother did.
His mother. The second question is, you talk about his dark and he was troubled by demons. You said you didn't want to talk about October 7th. I won't push you, but can you connect the dots in any way between his demons and Israel and what is happening now?
Yeah. I don't think I should dodge that bullet. Okay. He would, of course, have been horrified by October 7th. He would have been horrified by the unspeakable brutality of the Hamas murderers, but he would also have been horrified by Netanyahu's policies and the gang of nationalist fanatics, racists, and criminals that he assembled as a cabinet. And he would have said something like this: if you make the Palestinians feel utterly hopeless, as the present government has done, you know, their blanket opposition to 2 states, then they are going to turn to extremists who say the only way to solve our problem with the Jews is to annihilate them. And we can't possibly permit ourselves to do that, he would say. We have to find a way to of cautiously peaceful cooperation with this other people, which also has a right to the land.
Right here. I'm curious about the process of writing a biography, and I assume with such a rich subject, you had to find a why in terms of what this biography was going to be. And if you could express what that why was, and maybe a little bit about the decisions you had to make as you structured it, what you had to leave in and out, that kind of thing.
I didn't quite catch the why for what.
Well, you know, every biography has a why. I mean, you could have said, I want to capture something only a contemporary can capture while his contemporaries are still here, or I want to place him
see.
in a certain place, or I'm just curious about what you would say.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a single pat why. I would say, okay, I begin with the fact that Amos Oz was important in 2 respects. He was important because he was a writer of the first order of originality, and then he was a leading voice of conscience in his very troubled country. So the why I would ask as a biographer is, or maybe it's more a how than a why, how he came to do these 2 things. So that's pretty much okay. Now you had one other question?
perhaps answered it. I mean, with such a rich subject, and such a knowledgeable biographer, you could have gone in a lot of directions. But it sounds like with those two objectives to plumb it, that would force you to structure it with some psychology, as you've been talking about, and
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
so let me say this about structuring the book. I began as conventional biographies do with a narrative. And it was basically a narrative of the first, 25 years of his life, maybe a little bit, maybe just a few more. What his childhood was like. And of course, since he wrote about his childhood, I had to ask questions. What did he leave out? What was important to him? What more we can say about his childhood? So his childhood, the adolescence on the kibbutz, his army service, his marriage. So I tried to get that down in a consecutive narrative. But then I decided I didn't want to go on with a continuing narrative. And this is maybe a little unconventional for writers. So what I did was the rest of the book was structured topically. That is, I have a chapter on his fiction writing, how he came to be a writer of brilliant fiction at his best, and then a chapter on his friendship and personal relations, a chapter on him as a performer, and I listened to quite a few YouTube lectures that I hadn't actually attended, and what that told us about him, and then a chapter on him as a political activist. That's the way I did it.
Yeah, you're one of my favorite literary critics, so I wanted to dig into that piece of the book and just ask you, you mentioned Hannah and you mentioned the incredible female character in Judas
Yeah.
as sort of bookends, I think,
Right.
to his oeuvre. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, suppose you were asked to explain for the German publisher who did the survey, why is Oz where he is in that pantheon? And I'm just wondering if, I know you've written about him and his work over the years, if in the writing of the book, your sense of his literary importance and his characteristic as a literary figure shifted at all. So I guess there were two questions. One is, what would you say, if you were asked to sort of give the tribute, and defend Amos Oz as one of the 100 most significant writers of his times, and whether your sense of him as a literary figure and his importance as an author shifted as you wrote the biography.
Okay, well, the second question, I don't think it shifted. It maybe deepened a little. Of course, what I did was I reread not every single novel, but quite a few of the novels, and thought about them. And so when I reread My Michael, which I had not looked at since I read it in Hebrew in, 1966, 1967, I said, well, it sustains itself. It really is a remarkable novel. Now, prompt me on your other question for a minute. Oh, yeah, right, okay. Well, what dawned on me, if you look at other Israeli novelists, even A.B. Yehoshua, who is very concerned with the Israeli condition, but he does take the protagonist of one of his novels off to Germany, and now the lure of abroad, what you call in Hebrew chutz la'aretz, outside Israel, is very great for Israeli writers, but not for Amos Oz. That is, he made that decision early. That is, he says in A Tale of Love and Darkness, I first thought that a novel to be important has to be set in an important place, like Vienna, London, Paris, New York. And then, of course, famously, he read Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and saw that you could make great fiction by dealing with parochial people in a local place. So he steadfastly focused on Israelis. Occasionally, I thought that the focus was so sharp that I'm not sure people outside Israel could altogether understand it. Like, what is it, Late Love, a novella. There's this character who's been a kibbutz lecturer for 25 years. And he's originally from Russia, and he's obsessed with the threat of the Soviet Union, and thinks that Moshe Dayan can save him from that. And he's kind of a nut, but he's a very Israeli nut. And when I reread that story, I said, well, can somebody in Paris or London really get into this story? I'm not sure. But if I'm wrong about people getting into that kind of story, the fact of the matter is that he found a way to craft fiction that was intensely Israeli, but universal at the same time. Like my Michael, at one point Chana Gonen says something like, Jerusalem is an unreal city. It's full of shadows and dark places and melts when you look at it. Something that's a very rough paraphrase. Now, I thought, it struck me rereading that book that you can be in Tokyo or Los Angeles or Vienna or London and also experience your place as an unreal city. And so he had, I think, an extraordinary gift for making the intensely Israeli universal. And maybe above all else, that's what makes him an important writer. And that's why, say, A Tale of Love and Darkness had, like, I think it had several million readers globally.
We're going to take one last question. And then a reminder, Bob is going to be signing in the back of the room right after we're done.
Yeah, I was wondering if he's of a certain period of time, because he did pass away before October 7th.
Right.
And his ideology was of a certain period of time. And so much has changed, as you said, even before October 7th.
Right.
Within the 6-7 years before. So do you think he's, I don't know, again, did he just capture a certain time very intensely, but also universally? Or can it continue on through generations? I mean, that's maybe a heavy loaded question, but it's a question.
Well, I'd say this, that of course things have gotten drastically worse since October 7th. And I desperately hope that there will be a turning point beginning with the exit of the present Israeli government, and things will begin to get better. No one, including Amos, could have foreseen anything that terrible. And maybe the response is almost equally terrible. But I don't think that the nature of the conflict and the ideologies involved have changed. That is, he would, I think, staunchly say now, as I've been saying through the years, he puts it vividly in his last lecture. He said, okay, you can say it's important to carry a big stick, and Israel would not be here today if we didn't have a big stick. But you don't cure a wound with a stick. And he would stick by that, I think. So I don't think that the whole landscape has changed.
Thank you so much, Bob.